Since becoming a tokusatsu fan as a kid, it's been a whirlwind watching how things have vastly changed over the years. Back when I was 9, the idea of being able to import toys easily or watch stuff like G-Ranger whenever I wanted was unfathomable. Now it's something achievable with only a few mouse clicks and an internet connection. And while I do love the sort of renaissance, there are still a few things about the old days that I miss. The biggest among them, the concept of the sampler tape. Back in the day, if you wanted to get your anime or tokusatsu fix outside of Japan, and you weren't fortunate enough to live anywhere with a Japanese access channel, you either tried your luck at conventions, or you networked with your local anime club, tape traders, or just vendors who had catalogs of stuff for the taking. In the case of the latter, you often had to start those transactions by sending out for a sampler tape. $20 plus shipping would get you episodes from whatever shows you wanted to try out. Sometimes you start from the very beginning, and other times they would just straight up select episodes at random to sell you on. And if you were extremely lucky, they would be packed to the brim with vintage Japanese commercials. The end result were these unique mixtapes that in a pre-internet age, you never quite knew what you were getting into. So for this channel's 4-year anniversary, I felt like it was time to bring back this little gem in my own way. So for your consideration, I offer up these mini episodes, wrapped up in one big sampler tape package. For Vintage Henshin, I'm Mike Dent, and in honor of our 4-year anniversary, I give you the 4-year sampler. From the time I was a young pup in the fandom, there have been several repeated myths out there. Stuff like the 2 endings to King Kong vs. Godzilla.
Anyway, when they shot it, there was a Japanese ending in which Godzilla won, and an American ending in which King Kong won, because I guess they feel the countries have rooting interests in their own particular master.
Yeah.
Which show was supposed to be the last or the savior of Super Sentai. You've probably heard even crazier ones out there. Take into consideration that a lot of these stories did come out during a pre-internet age, where there were more hoops involved in verifying or denying such rumors. Fast forward to the present, and a lot of these myths, including the ones I just mentioned, have all found themselves debunked in one way or another. And as of 2022, we can now add one more myth to the chopping block. The famous/infamous mecca of Toei's 1978 adaptation of Marvel's most famous wall crawler. Inherited by Takuya Yamashiro after the death of Gaira, the fallen warrior from planet Spider, Leopardon was the humanoid battle mode of the spaceship Marveler. Packing one hell of an arsenal, and barely a spider motif to show for it, it has been jokingly dubbed the most invincible robot in tokusatsu history, even. And while the whole thing does fall a bit funny on the ears of diehard Spider-Man fans, it's important to note that due to its inclusion and success as a Toei, Bandai and Toei would move to keep the gimmick as part of Spider-Man's successor show, Battle Fever J, which in turn became the new standard for the then blossoming Super Sentai series. Literally, the giant robot battle trope, one of the hallmarks, would not have existed if not for Leopardon and Spider-Man. And yet, in spite of that achievement, in the show itself, Leopardon just kind of vanishes after a while. Leopardon appears in Spider-Man from the very first episode, each time rocking a new fight scene with the Machine Bem Monster of the Week. But then suddenly, after the first 12 or so episodes in the Toei manga Matsuri tie-in movie, any sort of sequence involving Leopardon starts to heavily utilize stock footage. In fact, for the remainder of the series, the same handful of shots of Leopardon walking through explosions and firing his weapons are reused time and time again, with the only bits of new footage per episode being interactions with said Monster of the Week. This is where the joke reputation of Leopardon being near indestructible comes from, because we never see him take any real damage in the battles after that point, and he just walks through whatever's thrown at him. So at some point, following Spider-Man's conclusion, rumors began to spread, namely that A, the show's effects budget dwindled after the first few episodes, and B, that the reason that Leopardon switched to being stock footage was because the suit had been stolen off set. And again, because it was a pre-internet age, if you repeat something that sounds crazy enough times, eventually it sticks, especially when there are people who are inclined to buy into the very cringy notions of, "Japan is so weird, am I right?" It's a fact that has been repeated time and time again, but there's never really been any hard evidence to lock it down. But What if I told you that changed? What if I told you that we may have finally gotten the closest thing to a last word on the subject? Because thanks to an interview via the Crew of Japan podcast, the mystery of Leopardon may have finally been solved. Recorded in 2022, the podcast interview included Gene Pelk, Marvel's former liaison and man in Japan, his son Ted, who had been on set as a child, and friend of the show Matt Alt, author of Pure Invention, a book I wholeheartedly recommend for anyone interested in the history of Japanese pop culture abroad. Towards the home stretch of the podcast, a question regarding the disappearance of Leopardon came up, and sure enough, Ted Pelk had an answer. According to him, the suit hadn't been stolen off set. Rather, it ended up being repurposed into another Sentai robot suit. Specifically, Dai Denjin, the first transforming Super Sentai robot from Denshi Sentai Denjiman. Now to better observe this, here it is, Dai Denjin as an SMP kit, standing next to the SMP Leopardon. Now, transformation gimmicks aside, if you look close, you can sort of spot the resemblances. As Ted recalled, no one to his knowledge had stolen Leopardon, and even if they had, it wouldn't have impacted the show all that much, since back then Toei would have had the money to just simply crank out another one. But if Leopardon wasn't stolen, why did Spider-Man suddenly switch to stock footage for the monster fights? Well, if one were to offer their tinfoil hat conjecture based on statements from the interview, it might have simply been a budget saver. As Gene Pelk recalled, one of the biggest issues facing Spider-Man was figuring out how to cut the budget, as the production team were shooting 2, sometimes 3 episodes simultaneously at any given time. Also take into account that the show wasn't structured around giant-sized battles the way that something like Ultraman was. They probably only had so much money to work with and a killer schedule to meet. So with that in mind, and given the track record of Nobuo Yajima, Spider-Man's effects director and overall master at cutting corners, the decision to switch to stock footage absolutely tracks and reeks of a first-time remove, what with this being a new gimmick and all. The downside, unfortunately, was that this impacted the final episode's big showdown, because in spite of the gravity of the climax, no new footage of Leopardon was shot for the occasion. So then where the hell did the rumor about the suit being stolen even come from? Both Gene and Ted had no idea during the interview. And in my own searches, I hadn't been able to find any hard source. I even went so far as to scour the old Usenet Alt-TV Sentai archives. At this point, I'm personally led to believe that it might have simply been a fan rumor that stuck, perhaps coming out of the disdain that some American fans had for the show back in the day. Now, newer fans refused to believe this since I mentioned it during my review of the Marvel 616 documentary, but there really was a time where just mentioning Toei's Spider-Man had the potential to just set some die-hard fanboys off the rails. I've been face-to-face with it even, and I've got a couple of horror stories. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if someone just spat out the explanation on a forum somewhere and no one bothered to question it. But either way, unless some new crazy source just bursts through the woodwork, we finally have the closest thing to a hard answer regarding what happened to Leopardon. And we can say with a degree of certainty now that Leopardon rocket punched so that literally Dai Denjin could fly. Speaking of things that happened in 2022, that year was the 50th anniversary of Ultra 7, a show and character with popularity rivaling that of the original Ultraman. When you bring up Ultra 7, at some point, talk of the banned 12th episode, From a Planet with Love, eventually pops up. For those playing at home, here's a quick Cliff Notes summary. From a Planet with Love gained Japanese media attention after a trading card was released naming that episode's monster, Alien Spell, with the description of Hibaku Seijin, which would have been fine if it wasn't for the fact that Hibaku is a word associated with survivors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And upon being faced with public uproar from an organization protecting bomb survivors from discrimination, Tsuburaya pulled the episode from rebroadcast. From a Planet with Love has never been released on home video and was only ever shown one other time, thanks to a bit of a materials gaffe in America during the English-dubbed run of Ultra 7 on TNT. But what if I told you there was another lost episode of Ultra 7? One that exists with an equal amount of fame and infamy. I present to you the 300-Year Revenge. While out mountain climbing, Ultra Guard member Ann Yuri ends up lost in the woods, but stumbles her way into finding a strange Western-style home. She comes face-to-face with an alien from the planet Torque. He first believes her to be his long-lost sister, but in time, Anne learns that the lone Torquian has been building a massive stockpile of weapons. 300 years in the making, for revenge against the Earthlings who killed his sister. And the time for implementing that plan is fast approaching. The 300-year revenge carried with it a bit of significance for Ultra 7. Not only would it have been an Anne-centric episode, but it also played on one of the central themes for the show, the notion of humanity being far from perfect, as well as alien persecution and prejudice. In this case, the episode was an allegory for the oppression of the Okinawans, pulling from the real-life invasion of the Ryukyu Islands in 1609 and its subsequent annexation as Okinawa Prefecture. Shozo Uehara, who wrote the episode, was from Okinawa, along with fellow writer Tetsuo Kinjo. Both Kinjo and Uehara would have experienced some of the most turbulent points in the prefecture's history around the time of the show's production, as well as during their tenures in Ultra Q and Ultraman. And this frustration would carry into their other work apart from the 300-year revenge. Kinjo would explore similar ideas in a later Ultra 7 episode, Emissary of the Namalt, while Uehara would tackle prejudice further in Return of Ultraman's The Boy and the Monster User, which is actually one of my favorite episodes. Now, as to why the 300-year revenge was never produced, you may get two answers. The one you might find, and the one that I got when starting research on this, is that it had to do with an on-set accident. As the story goes, during the production of Revenge, there's a scene where Anne, played by Yuriko Hishimi, is lowered to the ground by Ultra 7. This would have been achieved via a crane with a giant inflatable hand. However, while filming the scene, something went wrong. Thankfully, Hishimi survived the incident, but she would later approach Eiji Tsuburaya himself and ask him not to air the episode. He would oblige and pledge to never attempt a similar effect ever again. There's just one problem with that story. It's not true. So where did that story come from, and why does it keep popping up everywhere? Well, it's because the accident and the resulting aftermath were actually fictional events that appeared in the NHK docudrama My Beloved Ultra 7. While the two-part drama is absolutely fantastic and does a great job with depicting events behind the scenes, it does also take a chock full of creative embellishments, the entire incident being one of them. Thus, the second answer you'll get for why Revenge wasn't made, which you'll find upon looking things up in Japanese, is a disappointingly simple one. There was no budget for it. When Shozo Uehara submitted the script for Revenge, he was asked by the director if he could write something lighter. Not lighter in terms of subject matter, but rather the production budget. So Uehara ended up submitting the much simpler Search for Tomorrow, and the rest was history. While the story didn't make it to air, the concept for Revenge's armored humanoid, a servant robot who would have attacked Anne in the episode, was actually salvaged for episode 27 of Ultra 7, Operation Cyborg, where it became Alien Borg. The 300-year Revenge would join the ranks of the 14 Phantom episodes of Ultra 7. These are scripts that either died at the conceptual stage, were reworked, or simply cancelled for one reason or another. Case in point, what would have been episode 43, 15 aliens plus 35 kaiju, was also turned down for being way too ambitious with the budget, ultimately paving the way for one of the best episodes of the series, Nightmare on Planet 4. But Revenge would in time see the light of day, largely thanks in part to Shozo Uehara himself. The script for the 300-year Revenge was published as part of a feature on the writer in a 1984 issue of Uchusen magazine, and later in part of the Shozo Uehara scenario collection. In interviews, Uehara mentioned how much he believed in the story, along with his desire for it to actually be made someday. And after the aforementioned fictional depictions of it in My Beloved Ultra 7, as well as an adapted inclusion in the manga Ultraman 80 The Great Space War, the story was properly put to film thanks to the Ultra Heroine Legend DVD special. As part of a segment, Yuriko Hishimi narrated the original script, amidst Akioji Soji imagery and minimal scene reenactments. It's the closest Uehara would ever get to his dream of it coming to life, and thankfully enough, we didn't have to wait 300 years to see it happen. Let's rewind the clock back to 1984 for the release of a special videotape entitled The Birth of Silver Jaguar. With the cover boasting it as a co-production between Japan, America, and France, urging audiences to get in their first glimpse before it hits television and movie theaters, you'd be hard-pressed to know that the tape was effectively the swan song for one of the great innovators of the Henshin boom. Go! Launched in 1960, P Productions would make a big name for itself. dabbling not only in live-action productions, but also animation and a brief stint on stage. The company got its start doing title and composite work for Daiei, even helping out Toho for their early blue screen efforts in King Kong vs. Godzilla. But in time, they would be at the forefront of the second kaiju boom and Henshin boom, with television shows like Kaiju Oji, Spectre Man, both lion-maru shows, Tetsujin Tiger 7, Tenjin Zabogar, and the live-action adaptation of Osamu Tezuka's Ambassador Magma, known stateside as the Space Giants. The relationship with Tezuka went as far back as the original Astro Boy anime, due to Osamu Tezuka himself asking the company to subcontract production for episodes 93 to 144. P Productions, or simply P-Pro, had a unique flavor with its visual effects and stories that helped them stand out amongst their peers. But for every hit, there were several misses. P-Pro is just as known for all their projects that didn't get produced, like Jaguar Man. A handful of these made their way to home video in due course, which is where the birth of Silver Jaguar comes in. Because while the ad copy for said tape talked all about it being something you won't see on television or film, it's not an exaggeration or hyperbole, it's on account of how the project effectively imploded and never got picked up as a series. Now, information on this is somewhat scarce, but it goes a little something like this. In the early 1980s, P-Pro was set to co-produce a new television series that would have all the flair they were known for, while tapping the reservoirs of the then buzzing post-Star Wars SF boom. The project was named Silver Jaguar, then New Silver Jaguar, following a behind-the-scenes restructuring, and then, finally, Space Jaguar. The progression ironically mirrors the title changes of Spectre Man back in 1971. The show saw the titular hero, Silver Jaguar, in space, alongside Princess Love as they battled the forces of evil, with a plot and theme that borrowed heavily from Star Wars. A pilot was produced, pushing the main lore of the show and boasting the work of several top talents of the time. This included a frequent P-Pro collaborator, Yosaku Takayama, who had a hand in the overall art direction. A veteran of the Ultra series, starting with Ultra Q, by his 50s, he'd boasted one of the most impressive resumes for monster sculpting and model work on projects like Gamera vs. Baragon, Silver Mask, Fireman, Super Robot Red Baron, the list goes on. Unfortunately, Silver Jaguar would be his final project before his death in 1982. But perhaps the most fascinating tidbit about Silver Jaguar's production was that the project almost enlisted Ryuichi Sakamoto to work on the show's composition. For those playing at home, Sakamoto, a talented musician in his own right, also was one of the founding members of Yellow Magic Orchestra, one of the all-time greats in electronic music, if not Japanese music overall. By the time of Silver Jaguar's production, Sakamoto would have still been on the wave of YMO's successful landmark album, Solid State Survivor. And it's honestly kind of fun to imagine what Sakamoto at that time would have done with the tokusatsu soundtrack. Sakamoto ultimately wasn't brought on board and had to pass everything up, which, a bit of a shame, but it's probably for the best that it happened, because it meant that for the first time ever, P Productions company president Soji Uchiha was able to collaborate with his son, a prolific composer in his own right, Shiro Sugisu. Shiro's career spans decades, not just by himself, but as one of the founders of jazz fusion legend T-Square. Highlights across film and television include the live-action Casshern, Everything to Date for Bleach, Kimagure Orange Road, and recently SSSS.Gridman, Dynazenon, and Gridman Universe. If his name rings a bell, it's because you've probably been a fan of Hideaki Anno, as Sugisu has been one of Anno's longtime collaborators. Everything from Nadia the Secret of Blue Water to the iconic score of Neon Genesis Evangelion, and 3 out of the 4 Shin Japan Heroes Universe films to date all had his involvement. Even by 1980, Shiro had a lot of talent, and it was a great moment for father and son to finally be working together. By December of 1982, Soji Uchiha would travel to France to conduct final negotiations for the Silver Jaguar series. The specific reason for the co-production with a French company is unclear, but it does make a bit of sense when you consider the French popularity of Spectre Man. Hell, years later, crowds would be on their feet cheering for the arrival of Tetsuo Narakawa, Spectre Man himself, during a live stage show at the French convention Cartoonist. It made total sense, the fan base was there. This was a shoo-in for P Productions. That is, until it wasn't. Silver Jaguar's negotiations fell through. The plan initially had been for the series to begin broadcasting in France by 1984, with a goal of finding a Japanese network shortly after. With a failure in the negotiations, Silver Jaguar would never make it to series. Perhaps as a means to try and recoup production costs, the pilot was released as part of P-Pro's home video label as the birth of Silver Jaguar, enveloped by newly filmed segments regarding the show's theme song, production, and interviews. But if the ad copy for Birth of Silver Jaguar is any indicator, it was also a last chance to try and get some eyes on the pilot for further development. Sadly, this never happened. France was a no-go, as we mentioned, and as far as I was able to find in my own research, there's no detailed information regarding the supposed American involvement and how that turned out. So in the end, the release of Birth of Silver Jaguar was a kind of fumbled Hail Mary, leaving Silver Jaguar itself to become P-Pro's last original production to date. Anything that's come by since has only been remakes like Karate Robo Zabogar, or reboot attempts like Samuraion, which I am eager to talk about at a later date. And of course, there's the recent Antarctic Press Spectre-Man Heroes comic book series, which features pretty much every single one of the major P Productions superhero shows. Years later, P Productions would release a CD box filled with songs from the company's entire filmography. One of those discs would be a newly created mini-album with music rearranged by Shiro Sugisu himself. Among the tracks chosen was, sure enough, the theme he composed for Silver Jaguar. The collection of songs on the disc were made up of personal favorites, and it's not surprising that the track made the cut, perhaps getting the most love out of the bunch. While it may not have gotten a series, if Silver Jaguar can at least be remembered for being a killer musical collaboration between father and son, then so be it. It's absolutely staggering to even look back at the weird journey this channel has taken me on, let alone the amount of support I've received these past 4 years. You all have been amazing and so patient with me, computer boys and girls, and I could not have asked for a better group of people to share this adventure with. But it's not over yet. After all, I've got a promise to keep. Vintage Henshin will return, and I cannot wait for you to see what I've got in store for you.